Join us today. Jay teaches in the philosophy and government departments at the University of Texas at Austin. Jay's academic specialties include political philosophy, ethical philosophy, the interaction of religion with philosophy. He has worked particularly on the topic of classical natural law. That is to say, not the law written on tablets of stone or published in law codes, but the law written on our heart by our Creator. His most recent published book, I believe, is titled On the Meaning of Sex, which applies that general perspective to this topic about which there is so much interest and so much confusion in the world in which we live, and I dare say in the churches in which we work and worship. If we would begin to approach clarity on the subject and see it in the light that our Creator and Redeemer throws on our life, I don't know of anyone better to begin a conversation with than our guest today. So please join me in welcoming to discuss the topic, Why is there sex? Our speaker, Professor J. Budziszewski.
Why is there sex? You know, just this morning, I was having my coffee, and I opened up the Wall Street Journal and saw there an article on why people have sex. What are their motives? They said beyond the obvious, and so some scientists had done some research on this and classified 200 and some, I don't know, 217, 213, 200 and some reasons why that people gave for having sex. Now, it's a funny thing that that's how scientists would approach a problem like this, because it seems to miss the point. It's talking about people's motives. All right, you can do that very easily. You can just ask people, why did you do that? But I don't want to inquire into people's motives for having sex today. I want to inquire into why there is sex, why we have sexual powers, what the purpose of this is. You know, there's a difference between the purpose of something and the motives that people have for exercising it. The purpose of the lungs is what? You tell me. Breathing. For the purpose of what? To oxygenate the blood, right. All right, so that you can live. But on the other hand, somebody might use his lungs, his subjective motive for using his lungs might have nothing to do with that. He might want to sniff glue and get high. Okay? And it's astonishing, in many areas of discourse, it's considered illegitimate to talk about the natural purposes that are inbuilt in human nature, that are built into us, the natural purposes and meanings. People will say, you can't talk about that. That's the naturalist fallacy. An is does not imply an ought. You've heard that, I'm sure. But it's absurd. If I went to the ophthalmologist and he said, well, it looks like your vision is about 2400. And I said, well, that isn't good, is it? No. And he said, and I said, would corrective lenses take care of that? He might say, oh yes, and I could make them up easily. And I might say, well, why don't you make them up then? I would like that. Would you please do that for me? And then he said, why? You would think that there was something wrong with him, that he didn't realize that the descriptive fact that the purpose of the eyes is to see has evaluative consequences. Eyes that don't see well are poor eyes. Eyes that see well are good eyes, and what you ought to do with poor eyes is try to help them to see better. So of course the inbuilt purposes of things are real, and they have normative implications. We can't escape from them because they're not just biological facts. They are woven into us at every level. They are woven into our intellectual nature, our biological nature, our spiritual nature, our emotional nature. We are ordered to certain meanings and purposes. Human beings, for instance, are made with a view to family life. When human beings are separated from the members of their families, they commonly go through heroic efforts to become reunited with them. If there is natural disaster, if there is war, if there is something like this taking place. Children, if they are raised in orphanages. Now, don't get me wrong, I think an orphanage is a wonderful institution. If you can't find any family for the child, you've got to have them raised somehow. But even when efforts are made to make these orphanages as nearly like families as they can, which is a good thing, and even when the orphanages, by every standard that you can measure, on every index that you can measure, they're educationally superior, hygienically superior, and so on and so forth, nutritionally superior. The children, as psychologists will tell you, nevertheless do not thrive as well as they thrive in families with a mom and a dad. Isn't that interesting? Now, something happens, I notice, when I ask my students, when I'm talking about natural law, what is something for? I'll say, well, one of the things that natural law, one of the pieces of data that natural law begins with is the natural purposes of things, the meanings and purposes that are inbuilt in the human being. So let's talk about that. What's the purpose of the eyes? And they'll say, to see. Good answer. I'll say, what's the purpose of the ears? To hear. What's the purpose of the thumb? They might have to think for a moment, and then they say, well, so that you can work with the fingers and grasp. Good. What's the purpose of the eyebrows? They'll usually laugh, but somebody will say, well, it keeps sweat out of the eyes. It keeps them clear. Sure. Okay. What is? I then try to make it a little bit more difficult. What is the purpose of our intellectual powers? And they'll say, well, to think. And I'll say, yes, oh, sure, but that think is just a synonym for using the intellectual powers. For what purpose do we have such powers? For what purpose do we use them? And they'll say, well, to find out the truth of things and to figure out what to do. Good, very good. What is the purpose of the capacity for anger? Well, that usually takes a little bit, but people could work it out pretty easily to arouse us to the defense, to the appropriate defense, the measured defense of endangered goods. All right? All of these things make sense. Now, I'll ask, what is the purpose of the sexual powers? And all of a sudden, they give a different kind of answer. They say, well, pleasure. Well, now, I'm sorry, you jumped the train onto a different track here. You didn't say the purpose of the respiratory powers is pleasure, although you know it is pleasurable to take a deep breath. Feels good. You don't say the purpose of the muscular contracting power is pleasure, even though it does, in fact, feel good to stretch, right? You don't say that the purpose of, actually the exercise of every voluntary power is pleasurable. But we recognize that pleasure only identifies a motive that people may have in using the power. It doesn't identify its purpose. This is a crucial distinction, because you ought to use a power, whatever your motive is, it ought to be a motive that is not in conflict with the purpose. I'm not saying that there's anything in the least wrong with taking a deep breath because it feels good, but you know, you shouldn't be taking that deep breath that feels good in a way that interferes with its real purpose of oxygenating the blood by sniffing the glue. You shouldn't be. It's perfectly all right to enjoy yourself in eating a meal, but you shouldn't be doing it like certain ancient Romans are said to have done, where in order to prolong the pleasure of the feast, they acted as though pleasure is the purpose. And after they were full and couldn't eat anymore, they were taken into, I don't know, the backyard, the courtyard, and a helpful slave would offer them feathers that they could use to stimulate vomiting. They'd purge the meal, go back in so that they could have another course. We recognize that this is disordered. In fact, disgusting. Disgust is, can there is such a thing as irrational disgust, as culturally programmed disgust, but there is such a thing as natural disgust. Sometimes disgust is helpful data that calls our attention to the fact that something is, in fact, disordered. This is disordered. Now, the same thing is true with sex. The pleasure is fine, but the pleasure is not a measure of whether you're doing the right thing with the sexual powers here, because I've given you the example of sniffing glue, but take another one. One of the voluntary powers, contracting those muscles. It feels just as good to contract those muscles if I'm kicking the dog when I'm angry at him. But I really shouldn't kick the dog, okay? The pleasure is a byproduct of using a voluntary power, which may result, even if you're using it in a way that is not good for you, even if a way that is inimical to a flourishing and a well-developed life. So the measure for whether you're using your power, I should say exercising your power, better word. I don't want to speak in ways that sound instrumental here. For the way that you exercise the power is always connected with its proper purpose. What is the purpose of sex then? If I call my students' attention to the odd way they're jumping the tracks when they don't say pleasure about any of those other powers, but they say pleasure is the purpose of the sexual powers, then they'll think, oh, I get it. And then they'll say, well, of course, procreation. Good answer. It's not a complete answer, but it's a good answer. That's an answer that even a biologist could give. Even a person who did not in the least believe that human nature is a meaningful result of a creative God could still give. The power would not even have arisen. We wouldn't even have sexual powers if it weren't for their role in procreation. And by procreation, I don't just mean conceiving children or having children. I also mean the entire procreative process, which involves raising them, loving them, nurturing them, educating them, bringing them up in the love and fear of God. Okay? And you notice the procreative role of the parents is not ended when they pass beyond childbearing age and when their children are adults, because they're still involved in a secondary way in procreation, because then they help their children establish their own new families. Grandparents have a role in this secondary, this reflective way in the procreative process too. It continues lifelong. However, guppies procreate, and they do it differently than we do. Amoebas procreate, and they do it differently than we do. Planaria procreate, and they do it differently than we do. You could imagine human beings having been created like that. You could imagine that it might have been that the way new human beings come about is that, perhaps I might have come in today, and at the beginning of the talk, you noticed that my face was clear, but 5 minutes into the talk, there was a sort of a dark line dividing my face. And as I continued to talk, 15 minutes into the talk, it was becoming a groove. And then the two halves of my head were beginning to split apart, and a new half was forming on each side. And I split into two Budziszewskis, and one was here, and one was there. One got up and continued the talk. The other one, since he was now a distinct human being and you didn't need two people, went off and lived his life. You could imagine such a thing. That's how the amoebas do it. We don't. You could imagine us procreating like the guppies do. The mother and the father, it seems very strange to even say mother and father, because they don't occupy the roles of the mother and father. There's only the egg provider and the sperm provider. Their cooperation is at best for a moment. They don't, as I understand it, they don't even come into physical contact. They don't take care of the children. It is not like that for us. Our mode of procreation involves two different kinds of human beings who must cooperate. They must cooperate not only for conception, the male provides the sperm and the female provides the egg. They have to cooperate not only in gestation. The woman is harboring the developing child, the unborn child, and for that reason, she needs extra protection, which the male helps to provide. They need them not only for raising the child, because a child needs a model of a man, and a model of a woman, and a model of the relationship between them. And because, you know, there is something, have you noticed this? There is something incomplete in guys. There's something that they're missing. You know, there are things we tend not to get, and that the women in our life, whether we're single or whether we're married, tend to get, and we don't. And we need them to point these things up to us. Women, you know that this is true in the other direction as well. Each of the two sexes is incomplete. We need, the world is more balanced because of our cooperation, and it also has more color and light and melody in it because of this. It's much more charming. You know, according to our traditions, according to our stories of creation in Christianity, this is really a natural lawsy point, but Scripture talks about it too. Adam is born, and he appears to be complete by all accounts, right? There's just Adam. You don't need to speak about a male and a female, and he's lonely. There's not another creature found like him, and God takes Eve out of him. And only then does he say, "Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, at last, at last." Paradoxically, because of the incompleteness of the two sexes, they can form a different kind of unity, a higher kind of personal unity, communion, which would have been impossible if there was only one kind of us and it was complete. How funny that we can be more complete by being incomplete and joining in communion and joining in one flesh. This is something which is unknown to the guppies. This is something which is unknown, as a matter of fact, even to dogs and cats, which also, which also have, or birds, where the male bird helps out the mother bird, because this is something that's not just biological. This is something that is intellectual and spiritual. It is something that requires a rational mind. It is something that requires love. So that it turns out that the meanings or the purposes of human sexuality involve not only procreation, but also that remarkable kind of unity of the two procreative partners, which we call sexual love, erotic love. Okay? And its proper context is marriage, because that is the only place in which their partnership can reach fruition, and the only context in which it works out the best for the children. So these are the two meanings and the purposes: the procreative, and as it is sometimes called, the unitive. It's an awkward term in English. It sounds a little funny, the unitive. But these are the two meanings and the two purposes. A lot of the trouble that we get into is that we ignore these purposes, like those people that, those students I was telling you about who say the purpose of sex is pleasure. A lot of the trouble that we get into, though, is that we try to pick and choose among these purposes. We'll divide them from each other. We'll say, I'll never have any children, and that'll make my union with my wife even better. We'll just focus on each other. There's something wrong there. There is something deeply wrong to try to enhance the unitive good of sex at the expense of the procreative good. What ought to happen is this: we are very selfish. One of the first shocks to our selfishness comes when we fall in love and when we marry. Because you have to live sacrificially for somebody else or it isn't going to work. But that isn't enough of a shock. We are so selfish to be knocked out of the gravitational well, the black hole of self. We need more. The natural and necessary continuation of that is when you have children together. And you have to together give yourselves to this new life, who wakes up in the middle of the night, who disturbs your sleep, who wets his diapers, who poops in his pants, who empties out the goldfish bowl and says, but I thought he'd be happier in the toilet swimming there. And when they need us, they get the flu, they have to be taken to the doctor. All of this, they depend on us. This explodes. It destroys any further possibility of selfishness. It turns you inside out and puts you back together again if all goes well, as a different kind of person. Now, if two people say, well, we'll marry, but we don't want any children, and I have people who write to me about this. They write what I write about natural law, and they'll say things like, I belong to the child-free movement. What? You know, I didn't even know there was a child-free movement until people began writing to me. They say, you know, we believe love and everything else is much better without children. What's happening is that instead of turning two selfish individuals into self-givers, what happens is that you're turning those two selfish me's into a single selfish us. And the milk of the union curdles. So you cannot separate these. It's also true that you can't separate. That tells you what's wrong with trying to have the unitive without the procreative. You can't have the procreative without the unitive. All right? A child has the right to be born, to be conceived in the loving embrace of his parents. We should not be turning this into a process of factory production. One can imagine now, in a world in which people do think that all these things are separable, you can imagine somebody who, let's think of a young woman, she has Elmer in order to have good sex, but she has Felix to be a sperm donor, and she has Mary to be the surrogate mother, to gestate the child, and she has Frank to come and provide the child with some quality male time if he turns out to be a boy, because he needs a father figure. And we try to parcel, you can imagine, contracting out all of these functions. We aren't quite to that point, although we're getting close to it in the lives that some people try to live. Some people who write about the future look forward to this as though they think it would be a good idea. We're not quite to that point, but we are already thinking like that. And this is not how we are made. Living a way that we are not made to live, living in a way that cuts across the grain of the inbuilt meanings and purposes of human nature, accounts for so much of the distress of our lives today. Distress like what? Well, you know, it's not very hard to think of this. You didn't used to hear, when I was growing up, of young women who engage in what's called delicate self-cutting. I don't mean that they're using razors and they're cutting themselves, not to commit suicide. No, they're cutting themselves. There are all sorts of theories about this, endorphin rush or whatever. They cut themselves delicately, they bleed, they mop up the blood, they keep it a secret from other people. They may do this every night or during the daytime if they can find a secret place to do it. Why? I wonder whether this has something to do with a sense of disorder or even a desire to punish themselves. We read of young homosexual men who are what is called in the homosexual community bug chasers. This means that in order to increase your sexual excitement, you deliberately seek out sexual partners who are infected with deadly diseases. Because it makes it edgier, it makes it riskier, you might die. Doesn't that suggest that you are not quite in touch with the real meaning of it, that you have to give it this meaning in this perverse way? There is something wrong there. You have people, according to a survey of the Independent Women's Forum, I think it's called, that they commissioned some sociologists to do this. It's one of the biggest such surveys. They surveyed among other young women and asked them all kinds of questions. One of the questions was about whether marriage was an important goal in their life, and most of the, a majority of the young women said yes. Marriage is an important goal in my life. I want to get married. But then they asked them whether they engaged in hooking up, sexual encounters without any expectation of a relationship. The theory is then you can't be hurt, because if there's no relationship, there's no breaking up, right? So you'll be happier. Now, a large number of them, not a majority, are, yes, they're engaged in hooking up. Now, that's odd. So many of them are involved in hooking up, but they want to get married. Can you think of a behavior less likely to get you into marriage? And you know, it doesn't, in fact, remove the pain of breaking up. Though the people who study this, the literature of this is full of examples of young people who are depressed after the so-called friend with benefits. That's a slightly old-fashioned term now. I think it was used about 10 years ago. You know, the person you're having sex with but whom you have no relationship with decides not to have sex with you anymore. And of course you experience it as the end of a relationship, because sex is supposed to be adhesive. It is supposed to bond people together. It's like when you have sex with people without meaning and you do it with one person after another, what you're doing is you're sticking the tape onto you, you're pulling it off, and it hurts. Now you keep doing that, and what happens? You stick it onto you again, and you pull it off, and this time it isn't quite as sticky. You put it on again, and you pull it off, and this time it's less sticky still. And eventually, the tape just doesn't stick anymore. It has lost its power to bond you, and people look forward to that and say, yeah, then I'll be happy. But in fact, it means you're miserable because you have lost the capacity for romantic intimacy. It means nothing anymore. This is the world that we are stepping into. Now, I don't know why we find it so difficult to talk to people about this and to talk to our young people about this. We try to scare them. We talk about sexually transmitted diseases or unwanted pregnancies. Well, that's all right. That's about the biological side of it, I suppose, or disruption of life. But what about this? What about women waking up crying in the morning because the guy didn't even call her back? What about guys? Guys tend not to be quite as aware of their own feelings. You know. What about guys, though, who somehow feel a diminished sense of manhood? Well, of course. They're supposed to be connected with this woman, and they're just using her as a tool, and who are afraid to get up. The Peter Pan syndrome, not to get up, to grow up. The Peter Pan syndrome, I like to call this. These are very serious consequences. I met a fellow in an airline waiting room once. We were waiting to get onto the same plane. Struck up a conversation. He said, you know, I'm in my 40s and I've got kids in my teens, and I still don't feel like a grown-up. And I wanted to shake him and say, but you are a grown-up. You know, start thinking like one. He idealized the life of his teenager. He thought he had such a wonderful life, because he thought that the happiness of life is to have a lot of pleasure and amusement, and apparently he gave his son no responsibilities and just a lot of toys, and he thought, if only I could live like that too. This is not a flourishing life. This is a diminished life. We need to put it all back together. These are the natural laws of sex. You know, all of that stuff that you find in Scripture. Be faithful to your spouse. Save sex for marriage. Honor your parents. Take care of your children. All of those things that I won't say our mothers and fathers told us, or that necessarily even that our grandfathers and grandmothers told us, but at least that our great-grandmothers and great-grandmothers told us, turn out at the end of the sexual revolution to be true after all. So what I say is, let's stop revolving. The sexual revolution has turned far enough, and it's making people miserable. A last story to illustrate that misery and to illustrate the fork in the road that is before us. This came up by accident in one of my classes. I really don't set things up for it to come up, but they do come up. If you teach ethics, political philosophy, some of the classics like Plato's obsessed with sex, you know, inevitably questions about sex will come up in the classroom. And once they had come up in the classroom, and I said to the students, you know, I feel for you. I said, my generation invented the sexual revolution. But my sense of the matter is that yours is paying the price. I wasn't sure whether they would be annoyed by this, but one of the young men in the class raises his hand and he says, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. More than anything else, I long, I think he did say long, that's a very unusual word for young people today to use. It's almost embarrassingly intimate and strong. But he said, more than anything else, I long to fall in love with a woman and to marry her and to be faithful to her forever. And my heart soars. I thought, okay, good. You know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, my students didn't admit that there was any problem with the sexual revolution. He sees the problem. He said, but then he says, he breaks my heart again. He says, but I don't think it's possible. Because my parents couldn't make it work. Now, you know, you have to give him credit. He was trying to obey one of the rules here that's necessary for our fulfillment. He said, you know, he wanted to honor his parents. He loved them. And he thought if even people like I respect couldn't pull it off, it can't be done. It can be done, but we've lost the way of it. It takes a partnership of two people to understand the way of it and be committed to that, and not always be thinking, but there's a back door. How can we get back to that? I think we can get back to that. You know, it's not for nothing that societies have spontaneously developed these patterns. You will not find a society anywhere in the world that has no conception of marriage, no conception of fidelity, no conception of appropriate restrictions on sex. Each society, it is true, because of human sin, tries to cut itself certain exceptions, and cheats, like the gamers talk. What are they called in gaming, in computer gaming? There are these back doors and cheats that people do. You know, cultures cut themselves those too, because there are two things going on in the heart. There is the law written on the heart, which is universal, but unfortunately there's also a universal desire to evade it. Well, we've been working on evading it a lot harder than we've been working on recognizing the law. I think that we need to recognize the law not as something that diminishes our freedom, but as something that is an absolute necessity for having any freedom at all, for being able to live responsible and meaningful and happy, flourishing lives. And so I commend that to you. Thank you.